The scandal around the IRS and conservative political groups keeps getting bigger. And now Congress is launching multiple investigations to find out what the tax agency was really up to.
Pat, they want to know why the IRS was asking ordinary citizens everything from what they were reading to what they were praying about. Well, Jennifer Wishon has more on this story.
Adam Brandon says he knew something was going on when he started getting calls from groups seeking tax-exempt status, asking him if it's normal for the IRS to inquire about what books they're reading. What the vice president of FreedomWorks didn't know was the magnitude of the scandal.
When a government decides to start targeting its own citizens for no other reason than their political affiliation, we all have a right to be very, very scared.
Reading materials, names of donors, social media posts. That's the type of information the IRS wanted. Some groups were even asked to give information about their prayers.
Specifically asked from the IRS to the Coalition for Life of Iowa, quote, please detail the content of the members of your organization's prayers. Would that be an appropriate question to a 501c3 applicant? The content of one's prayers.
It pains me to say I can't speak to that one either, but that's an...
You don't know whether or not that would be an appropriate question to ask an applicant?
Speaking outside of this case, which I don't know anything about, it would surprise me that that question was asked.
Asking about the contents of prayers is something Lois Lerner is familiar with. Before taking over the IRS's Exempt Organizations Division, Lerner led the enforcement office for the Federal Elections Commission. During her tenure, the FEC led a major controversial investigation of the Christian Coalition. Testimony reveals the FEC asked Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North whether or not he was aware Pat Robertson was praying for him. The Christian Coalition was cleared of any wrongdoing, and Lerner eventually got her job at the IRS. Now she's been put on leave with pay as the scandal is being investigated. Brandon says fear of being targeted by the IRS is making some conservatives who might get involved in politics ask themselves if it's worth it.
If I stay active in my church, if I stay active in my Tea Party group, am I going to be targeted? Am I going to be singled out? It's very intimidating when the government is able to use the power of taxation to potentially target its adversaries.
I've got no patience with it. I will not tolerate it.
The White House is taking heat for its shifting story of who knew what when. The executive branch appeared to be taken off guard by the scandal, even though the IRS falls under the purview of Mr. Obama's Treasury Secretary. Now the big question is, who's responsible? Who ordered the IRS to target Tea Party and conservative groups? Critics find it hard to believe a problem this big is contained to one IRS office in Cincinnati.
I would kind of sleep better at night if this was directed by someone in the White House or some agency, but I'm actually very fearful that this is just bureaucrats gone crazy. I think we're just starting to get into where this originated, who knew what, when, and I believe, like Watergate, this is probably going to be a scandal that's going to continue to drip, and we're going to learn more as time goes on.
Jennifer Wishon, CBN News, Washington.
Well, Jay Sekulow of the American Center for Law and Justice is representing many of these conservative groups. Jay, did you file a lawsuit yet, or are you getting ready to?
Here it is, Pat. It's about an inch thick, as you can see, and the lawsuit is being filed literally as we speak in Washington, D.C. against the federal government, the IRS, Treasury as well. And let me just say one other thing. There's been some questions about whether this was just the Cincinnati office or whether it was other offices. I just want to make very clear here, we've released this letter now, but Pat, this is a letter from the United States Department of the Treasury, Internal Revenue Service, Washington, D.C., from a tax law exempt specialist, a lawyer with Treasury, to one of our clients. So we're representing 25 clients. The lawsuit's been filed, or it will be filed shortly, and litigation starts, which is what needs to happen here.
All right, well now, what are you saying in the litigation? What is the gravamen, if I can use that term?
Sure. There's several causes of action. Of course, free speech and freedom of association violations, that primarily focusing on the request for membership lists, membership data, viewpoint discrimination, because they ask not just what positions are important to you or what issues are important, but they actually asked what is your position with regard to those issues, which the government really has no business doing. We don't have just Tea Party cases or just conservative organizations, although the organizations share a conservative philosophy. We've got some that are educational groups that were targeted. They kind of put in this dragnet by the IRS targeting practice. We also have a claim for a violation of the Administrative Procedures Act. We have a claim for damages, and we also have claims for violation of the Internal Revenue Code. We've got a team of lawyers right now at the ACLJ, Pat, that are preparing Freedom of Information Act requests that will go out to see if we may have an unlawful or involuntary disclosure issue where the IRS or Treasury or someone shared information with a government agency or individuals that they were not supposed to do. And Pat, you may remember this. My first job out of law school a long time ago was with the Office of Chief Counsel, Internal Revenue Service. I was a trial lawyer for the IRS. They were our client. Tax Exempt was one of those clients. Well, one of the young lawyers, friend of mine, we actually had offices next to each other at Treasury. He's handling another case similar to this one as well. So we got former IRS lawyers, former U.S. attorneys that are now part of this legal team. So this is a major challenge going forward. You'll see multiple lawsuits. The first one that we've got is 25 plaintiffs in this one. There's going to be more filed next week.
Jay, when you talk about damages, who's been damaged and why and how much money is involved?
Well, for instance, we've got one client that had a $30,000 grant that they were awarded subject to obtaining their 501c4 status. They were not able to obtain it, and it's not been denied. It's still pending. They lost that $30,000 grant. Many of these clients, Pat, before we got involved, had legal and accounting fees. You can imagine this was going on for 3 years. Significant time. Loss of revenue from not having the exemption, expenses, and attorney's fees. So this is very serious litigation, and we've made very serious allegations. Of course, the government's admitted here that they violated the law. You now have people need to realize you got the FBI investigating the IRS. This is unprecedented, and I think it shows the scope and nature of what's really happened here.
Jay, Lois Lerner, took the fifth in her testimony before Congress. What was the crime she was trying to avoid confessing? If I can use that.
Well, probably lying under oath. Making false statements to the United States Congress. She's not the only one that's got trouble with that right now. The Attorney General has got some serious problems right now, as that's been reported in a lot of sources the last couple of days. But she made statements where she said she was engaged in no wrongdoing. She did not give inaccurate information when we know that's not true. And she gave a very bizarre Fifth Amendment privilege by claiming her innocence first, talking about her previous testimony, and then claiming the fifth raises another serious legal question of whether Lois Lerner actually is able to take the fifth. But Pat, I'll tell you how I'd handle the case. What I would do is I would not give her immunity right away, but I would certainly give immunity to the lower level agents that were just executing orders from above. Find out everything you can from them, then go to Lois Lerner. Maybe give her a limited immunity based on statements, get the information from her, and find out who really made this decision and how high up and where. When, of course, Lois Lerner was high up, but I think it went a lot higher than her.
Jay, I was, as you know, president of the Christian Coalition, and the Christian Coalition was sued by the Federal Election Commission. It was a huge case, took years, depositions coming out of the gazoo, and we were under scrutiny. And when it was all over, the FEC lost resoundingly. But Lois Lerner at that time was head of enforcement for the Federal Election Commission, and they were asking stuff like, what was the content of your prayers? I mean, who ever heard of such an outrageous thing?
Well, the IRS is doing that right now. I mean, Pat, the questionnaires that went out included things like, prayer activity and do you pray a particular prayer. We had other clients that were asked what the curriculums they were endorsing and who the names of the students, minors we're talking about, that they were teaching, which obviously was inappropriate questions. So this, attack on prayer is not surprising. This is an agency that is completely out of control. Right now, Treasury is, I'd say the IRS in particular, is institutionally incapable of regulating itself. And Pat, we received a letter. They keep saying, well, this stopped in March of last year. It's not true. We received a letter May 6, 2013 in our office with asking again those intrusive questions. We're talking about, less than 3 weeks ago. So this idea that this has stopped, and we, by the way, have also signatures of letters with Lois Lerner's stamped signature on it. So to say she was not involved with intrusive questions is also incorrect. And for the life of me, I can't figure out, Pat, why the IRS keeps, denying this or doesn't know this when we have the letters. We have the documents. These aren't hard to get. Their agents wrote them to us. 15 agents, 4 different offices.
You know, this violates everything that we think about the freedoms we enjoy in this country. I mean, for the government to come in and say, what were you praying about? I mean, this is outrageous. This is, I mean, it's an outrage of massive proportions. And then you couple this with all the denial, and the president says, well, I really don't know what's going on over there. I don't know anything. The next thing you know, the day after it, he fires the head of the organization. Well, what is it?
Well, here's what you've got. I mean, we know that White House counsel and the chief of staff and the deputy secretary of the Treasury, and that's, by the way, that's a confirmed position, the deputy secretary of the Treasury, all serving at the pleasure of the president, especially his White House staff, were in conversations with Lois Lerner about how to get ahead of the Inspector General's report. And the White House was trying to figure out the best way to do that. And then they did that fake planted question. I mean, people need to understand the IRS went out to an ABA meeting and planted a question about conservative targeting to try to get ahead of the Inspector General's report. This is absurd, and I think that, and also I think what you're going to see here, Pat, is a complete overhaul of the agency, which is long overdue. I got my start at that agency. I have a lot of respect for it, but I will tell you this: disappointing is an understatement. That's why we're in federal court with a inch-thick complaint.
Do you think they'll come after you? Will they come after you?
Oh, you know, wouldn't that be something? If, we've been audited before, as you know. That's pretty typical. I can't imagine. We just actually were audited a few years ago. They went through everything. We got a complete, clean bill of health. Not one change to one nickel of an adjustment. But wouldn't that be something for the IRS to go after the lawyers that were involved in bringing these cases forward? That would show some kind of effort. But I'll tell you something else, Pat. I've got another. This is pretty recent. In the last few days, we got a compliance letter sent to one of our clients, a C4, a random compliance letter where you go online and fill out an 8-page questionnaire. And that came in the middle of this scandal to one of our 501c4 clients. So I'm asking myself, what is this agency doing? But Pat, if they want to audit us again, go ahead. But the fact of the matter is they just did. They spent a lot of money auditing us, and we came out great with not one nickel adjustment. And I'll tell you something. These clients we're representing, it's the same thing. These are small organizations, though. We'll be filing a lawsuit for a much larger one next week. But these are organizations that revenue was less than $100,000, some of them less than $10,000. And to put them through the ringer like this is outrageous. And Treasury should be embarrassed. And by the way, that apology they offered? Not accepted. Our answer to the apology, this federal lawsuit.
Jay, last question. What about Eric Holder? He apparently has perjured himself. You think he's going down?
Boy. I'll tell you something. We had that. Remember in Fast and Furious, he issued that statement, said there was no gun running. He told that to the United States Congress. And 9 months later, he comes back, writes that letter, pulls it back, saying, I made a mistake, which, by the way, if anybody else did that, you'd end up in jail. Well, now you've got this information on the James Rosen from Fox News that basically they've accused him of a crime, co-conspirator, and the warrants that were going on there, or at least the information gathering that they did through subpoenas. That is creating a huge stir within the media. But then, Eric Holder basically said he never did it, never would do it, and we find out he did. I think the Attorney General is in serious trouble. And frankly, it's about time. Enough already. This guy, Eric Holder, has gotten away with running this Department of Justice into the ground. And again, I've trained U.S. attorneys on prosecutions for the Justice Department's legal office, their legal education office. So again, a lot of respect for the agency, but Pat, how much longer can that go? Eric Holder needs to step aside.
Well, I'm not too much in favor of these special prosecutors because they just have a life of their own. Me neither. But how are you going to investigate it? The Fox doesn't investigate who's working in the henhouse. Who's going to investigate Holder?
Well, Darrell Iss's committee's on oversight's a good committee. They're tough. They're very good. They've got good investigators and good inspectors. I think that's the way to do it. I'm not real keen on the special prosecutor approach right now either. I think it's going to slow the process down. We need to get answers. I think between the lawsuits that have been filed, Freedom of Information Act requests, which have been filed, and others that we're doing are coming, coupled with the congressional oversight committees, we'll get to the bottom of this.
This could be a death by 1,000 cuts. He can bring down the Obama administration, certainly tie him up. I don't know. If I were Obama, I'd fire everybody I could as quick as I could and get on with life. I don't know what he's going to do.
Well, He did that with the the acting commissioner Miller, but he was going to leave a month later anyways. They tried to get Lois Lerner to resign. She's now on administrative leave. But Pat, you're right. At the end of the day, I don't think this is. I think they probably insulated the president from this. But his White House counsel knew, his Deputy Secretary of Treasury knew, and his Chief of Staff knew. And the president said, "I learned about it by reading it in the paper or hearing it on the news." Pretty shocking statement coming from our Commander-in-Chief.
Well, Jay, keep it up. It's an amazing thing. It's a can of worms, and the worms just keep on coming out. Jay Sekulow, God bless you.
You're right.
Well, something
Thanks, Pat.
good may end up coming out of the IRS scandal. Lee Webb has that story from the CBN newsroom. Here's Lee.
That's right, Pat, and Jay mentioned this in his interview with you. Some in Congress are hoping that the attention will lead to more public and political support now to simplify a complicated and burdensome tax code. It's gone through around 5,000 changes in just the past dozen years alone. Lawmakers in both parties say the current IRS scandal proves that the complex tax code gives the agency too much power to interpret and enforce the law. And they say simplifying it would cut the IRS's power. David Kemp is the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, which writes tax bills. He has a compelling phrase for the current tax code. Take a look at this. He calls it 10 times the size of the Bible with none of the good news. Conservative Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann has announced she will not run for another term. Bachmann is a Tea Party favorite who ran for the Republican presidential nomination last year. She announced her decision on YouTube. She said it wasn't based on concerns about a tough re-election campaign, nor about inquiries into finances in her presidential campaign last year. Instead, she says 8 years is long enough to serve in the House of Representatives. She once told CBN News that her greatest desire is to please God. Another round of the legal battle over Bible banners at high school football games in Texas. A district judge had ruled that the banners inscribed with Bible verses are not forbidden by the U.S. Constitution. But the Kuntz School District is appealing that ruling. They want to know if the cheerleaders have a free speech right to include the Bible messages on those banners. They say the original ruling did not make that clear. Religious leaders in New York City scored a political victory in their ongoing fight to hold worship services inside public school buildings. The City Council passed a resolution encouraging the state legislature to take a vote to allow faith-based institutions to rent space. The council passed the measure with a vote of 38-11. A pastor leading the fight said, "We love our city, we love our mayor and chancellor, and we love those who have opposed us. We now look to Albany for the next step." Albany, a referral to the state capitol in New York. Freedom to worship legislation passed in the state Senate there last year, but it's been held up, Pat, in the state assembly.
We've had cases from the American Center for Law and Justice. The first, long time ago, was Mergens versus Independent School District. That was started by the National Legal Foundation, which later became the American Center for Law and Justice. Jay Sekulow won that case in the Supreme Court 7-2, saying that students did not lose their citizenship rights when they entered the schoolhouse doors, and that there was no constitutional requirement or restriction permitted on the expression of faith by students. So that is the one having to do with banners. Then we had another one called Lamb's Chapel versus Center Mauritius School District that Jay litigated and won. And it was tough because the Second Circuit was all against him, and they kept beating him down. They'd rule against us, and we'd go to the Supreme Court and win. But nevertheless, that was one that said that if they're going to have a forum for other groups, they had to accommodate religious groups as well. So I don't know what this suit is all about now. They're asking Albany to make a declaration, but congratulations to the Board of Supervisors of the city for what they have had to say.
Extreme weather continues to sweep across America with another batch of severe storms on tap today. There were at least 20 reports of tornadoes overnight from Texas to Michigan. In Kansas, a massive twister demolished buildings and sent farm equipment flying like toys. Homes were destroyed and trees snapped in half in Flint, Michigan. Meanwhile, rain continues to cause flooding in parts of Iowa, and dry conditions and high winds are fueling brush fires in California. The U.S. Supreme Court is refusing to hear a case that could have cut some of the funding for Planned Parenthood in the state of Indiana. Abortion opponents there were trying to impose a law banning all Medicaid money from going to abortion providers like Planned Parenthood. The Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals blocked that measure, though, from going into effect, and the Supreme Court let that decision stand. You can always get the latest from CBN News by going to our website at cbnnews.com.